All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassie Daffin. I am coordinator of conferences here at American Frozen Food Institute, and we would like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on frozen food sales amid COVID-19. Before we get started on the presentation and introduction of our speaker, just a few housekeeping things I'd like to go over. All attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar, and we will not be answering questions about the webinar until after the presentation. We will have a Q&A section. If you have a question at any time that you would like answered at the end, if you go to the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen, if it's not fully expanded, it should be a small blue box at the bottom of your screen. And there is a tab for Q&A. Please enter your questions there, and I will read them aloud after our presentation is concluded, and we will answer them in the amount of time we have left. This webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to registrants afterwards. And I'm going to turn this over now to AFFI's Vice President of Strategic Communications, Adrienne Seeling.
Thank you, Cassie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For the past month, AFFI has partnered with Anne-Marie Ruhrink of 210 Analytics, who's today's speaker, to bring you weekly frozen food sales data at retail. These reports are available at AFFI's website. And we know based on these weekly reports that frozen food sales at retail have drastically increased. But we wanted to understand more about consumer purchasing habits of frozen foods. So we are pleased to be joined by Anne-Marie, who's going to share the key findings from our latest consumer survey. And she's also going to provide us with a broad look of the overall retailing conditions and consumption patterns. Anne-Marie is no stranger to those of us in the frozen food industry, as she helped us design our Power of Frozen in retail study that we launched last year. This is also available on the AFFI website. She understands the challenges and opportunities in the grocery retailing business, and she is the go-to resource when it comes to everything you want to know on the ever-changing wants and needs of the grocery shopper in a one-size-fits-no-one world. Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Adrienne. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me back on, Adrienne. And yeah, let's have a look, because boy, what a different world has it been. Let me find my arrow keys here. But I do want to point out that obviously for many of you that are in the frozen food world, you know this, but we started a comeback quite a few years ago, in 2016, in fact. And initially, a lot of the naysayers were not sure whether or not frozen food sales were going to continue to be very successful. But as you can see, if you look at that light blue line, all of a sudden, come 2017, we started to poke out over total store sale, over the fresh perimeter. And if we go back a couple of years, we knew the fresh perimeter was far outperforming every other part of the store. A lot of retailers announced that they were wanting to push more of labor and SKUs and space in the store toward fresh and really make that a focal point of their retail operations. Now, if you look at the last couple of years, including 2019, frozen food sales continue to track extremely strong. And I think that's an important point to make, because the comeback and the extreme popularity of frozen foods during COVID-19 is not something that came out of nowhere. This has been a while into the making, and we just really saw a strengthening of trends that we have been seeing for several years now. Just a couple of quick marketplace pictures, because it's important to understand the backdrop between everything that is happening in the store and really against which a lot of those retail numbers that we're going to talk about came to fruition. Now, we've all experienced these as consumers, as grocery retail professionals, but it's important to keep in mind that the enormity of the spikes that we saw in food retailing sales came while we were trying to meter the number of consumers that came into the store, making sure we didn't have more consumers than we were allowed to have according to mandates by the government in some states. A lot of stores have started to implement a specific way in which you're supposed to walk through the store. Now, that can drastically change how a consumer ends up walking through the store, if you think about it. And that might also mean that they're now walking through the frozen food aisle in a different direction than they used to. So things like end caps and things like secondary placements, they might not be as prevalent in frozen foods, but they are very differently today than they are in years past because of specifically routing people a certain way. We're seeing grocery stores space out people at the front end. So you can only imagine how much front end sales have been impacted by measures like that. But more than anything, even though I understand many of you on the phone today are more on the supplier side of things, there's an enormous focus among consumers to try and understand what brands, what manufacturers, and what retailers are doing to protect both their own employees, but also to protect the shopper. There is some fear out there about interacting with fresh foods, as we'll see here in a little bit, but also the whole notion of is it safe to touch packaging that might have been touched by somebody else? And so being very visible and communicating, regardless of where you sit in the supply chain, about what your company is doing to keep people safe is extremely important in today's environment. In terms of frozen food, we all of a sudden saw a lot less competition too in terms of that full meal solution. We all know there's a lot of times in our busy lives that it comes down to I'm either not in the mood to cook or I'm just simply out of time to cook. And that's when we start looking for time-saving solutions. Frozen was always one of those. But it's important to keep in mind that restaurants were a big competitor. Deli prepared was a big competitor. And all of a sudden, in the midst of coronavirus, a lot of stores started to close all their deli operations and started to change to a system where maybe things were prepackaged. And in a way, frozen food solutions became one of the last men standing throughout all of that. We all saw the completely empty shelves, regardless of the store. A lot of reporters are asking me, is this something that has happened before? And my answer is, well, during hurricanes or blizzards, we see maybe 300-400 SKUs start to move extremely fast, anything from toilet paper and water and cereal and those types of things. But not everybody or very few people start to stock up on items that are frozen or refrigerated because we don't know if we're going to have power. This time around, virtually every category in the store was highly affected, and not just for a week or two, but really a prolonged period of time, as we continue to see in the numbers here in a minute. So it's all resulted in very different consumption occasions to start. So first of all, our survey with the Frozen Food Institute found that 90% of Americans are saying that they are eating more meals at home than meals sourced from restaurants or eaten at restaurants. So that is an enormously important number. And even though it won't surprise anybody that this is happening, 90% of Americans saying that is huge. And I think the other part behind it is oftentimes we think about dinner when we talk about meals. But it's important to point out that in this particular case, people are suddenly sourcing breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, the evening snack, etc., all at home. Schools are closed, people are working from home, kids are home from universities. So it's a whole different ballgame in terms of who is sitting around the table, the types of meals that are eaten at home, and clearly frozen is playing a huge role in all of this, both as a total meal solution, but also as part of a meal solution. We're also seeing in that survey that we did that 73% of shoppers say they are taking more time to prepare meals. That's a really important finding as well for those of you on the phone that are more of a meal ingredient versus a full meal component. So think about things like frozen vegetables, frozen meat. All of a sudden, people are spending a lot more time on dinner. If you go to Pinterest, for instance, or any of the recipe sites that are putting out statistics, we see surges in anything from baking to easy meals from the freezer, how to use up the stuff in my pantry. People are looking for recipes to really shake up their routine. We have to keep in mind, oftentimes when people ate out, it was just to have something different. And people now all of a sudden have to create that something different. So being a helping hand in that as a retailer or as a manufacturer can be a huge way to win loyalty during these times. But more than anything, what we're seeing too is a trend toward what I dub insourcing. So we see people buy vegetable seeds to start growing their own tomato plants. We're seeing people buy things like bread makers, instant pots, hot air fryers, those types of things, because they're wanting to learn how to make their own artisan bread, how to create meals that they've never made before, and replace their Starbucks run with their own coffee maker at home. Now, if you think about all those people that have bought freezers over the last month, have bought these different types of appliances, more than likely, as long as this is lasting and we're not through it yet, the longer people are testing a new habit, the more likely it is to stick around, especially if they've made an investment like a bread machine or bought a freezer. So these are all things that can start to turn from short-term habits into longer-term areas. But we're also seeing gigantic differences in how people shop. And a lot of this impacts you regardless of where you sit in the supply chain. So initially during the height of the recession, and we'll look at some of those numbers, we saw a huge increase in trips. Often that was because people were trying to stock up, but they're also starting to run into out of stock situations. So they started to run around to different stores to buy everything that they were looking for. Now we're seeing actually a little bit of a trip contraction, and shoppers deliberately choosing one store that they're interested in spending most of their budget. So we're seeing a huge increase in the number of dollars spent per trip, but there is going to be a little bit of contraction into the number of trips, especially if we start looking at other countries that are a little bit ahead of us. That is one of the bigger trends you're seeing. A retailer said to me, and I love this saying, every day is Saturday. So traditionally, a lot of the dollars were spent over the weekend. That is all shifting. We're seeing people engage with the retail environment any time of day, any day of the week. We're still seeing a little bit of a bump, obviously, on the weekend, on that first week of the month, but much less so. And people are deliberately trying to find days where things are not as busy. We know retailers have shortened hours. All of that impacts the supply chain because it just matters when you pump stuff into the stores now. A lot of people believe that those behaviors are here to stay as well. Even if restaurants open back up, be it at limited capacity or full capacity, 43% said, yeah, I don't know. There might be some economic pressure. There might be some social anxiety. I'm not so sure if I would go right back to purchasing less groceries and going back to restaurants. So there's a lot happening on that front. So what has happened since early March? Well, this is the graph that shows what we call total edibles. Those are the IRI definitions for really anything food. IRI has been a big partner for us in all of this. And as you can see here, we see three different sections. If you go back all the way to March 1st, which is that first data point, everything was still fairly normal, and all the growth rates were very much in line with what we had been seeing in 2019 and the times in early 2020. Starting March 8th, we saw things like non-edibles, as we call them, gearing up, cleaning supplies, hand sanitizers, anything bleach, because people were trying to protect themselves from getting the virus. So that really started March 8th. And the two big weeks that you're seeing, that's March 15 and March 22nd. Those were enormous panic buying weeks. Frozen set even higher than these numbers. And then it started to come down a little bit of a bump for Easter, and we continue to see these kinds of trends line as more of those meals are sourced at home, like we found in the AFFI survey as well. So shopping trips really peaked. What you're looking at here is a lot of numbers, and you can download these slides, as we mentioned earlier, afterwards, and I'm always available too if you need to email me, ask me some questions. But highlighted in bright green are those areas where the weeks really over-indexed in the number of trips. So as you can see, those were the big weeks, March 15 and March 22nd, where regardless of whether we were looking at frozen or health items or beverages, everybody was going to the store stocking up on those. Now, the important part for the folks here on the phone today is if you look at frozen, which is the second line in that second block of numbers, we continue to have a very high index. Just to remind everybody, the way indexes work is an average is 100. That's when we're right on the norm of what it was always been. Now we're still looking at frozen in very high trip indexes for even the week of March or April 12th, which is Easter week. So it's not just a matter of having stocked up the freezer because we were worried. It continues to be more trips, more spending, which means people are actually using what they put in their freezer. They're using frozen in their everyday extra meals that they're preparing at home. Now, we're also looking here at the average basket size. Jumping right to frozen, still the second line from the second block. We saw some huge index numbers in those big weeks of March 15 and March 22nd, but it continues to spike really, really high. We're one of the only areas that is still in that darker green for more of the recent weeks. So that means that people are not only buying it more often in terms of trips, they're also continuing to spend more than they were before. And that's just fantastic news for the category. We're seeing a shift overall. This is, again, total edibles. We're seeing a little bit of a shift to private brands. Now, some consumers said, look, I just grabbed whatever was available on the shelf. So this is not necessarily because that was my first choice, but it was simply whatever was available. But 54% said, well, I have deliberately chosen, or 59%, I should say, is I have deliberately chosen store brands in order to save money. So we are seeing some of those behaviors that typically happen when recession hits. We're starting to see those pop back up. A little bit of the stocking up, the private brands, the money-saving measures. They change as time comes by, but these is one of the earlier ones that typically pops up during those times. In frozen foods, we've always seen much more engagement among higher income households, about households with children living at home, and we continue to see that in total food as well. So people with children at home have a much greater impact on all that rise in spending than singles and dual households. And, you know, to an extent that makes all the sense in the world, but what I'm trying to say is they're actually over-indexing. And I think part of that is if we think about the typical children's day, many of them are in school. They might eat school lunch, school breakfast, or they're in daycares, or they're away at campus. And so those are a lot of extra meal occasions. An example I often reference is I live in Florida, and the last week of March was spring break here. And on the news, they said 350,000 students would normally go back to campus this week. Well, if you think about 350,000 students that are now at home times a minimum of 3 meals a day, that is 1 million meal occasions every single day that are now in the at-home environment versus at campus. And that's just Florida alone. So we're just looking at many more, and children is a big part of that. It just kind of emphasizes, I should say. Online explosion. So one of the biggest trends that we're seeing too is a shift to online. So if we look at the online shopping patterns over the last couple of years, Adrian talked about the power of frozen. We looked at it in there and many other studies, and we typically saw a number right around 40% of people who said, I have bought groceries online in the past year. Now, the really important stat is the stat behind that, and that was how often do you buy it? Because among those 40%, more than a third actually only tried it once or twice. We know a lot of retailers are incentivizing online shopping to see if it's something that people like. And even some of the folks that did do it with a little bit of a higher frequency, there were still between 3 and 4 weeks of lag time in between online orders. And only 9% of shoppers were actually ordering frozen, or were ordering online, I should say, every week or every 2 weeks. So a very low percentage. And that's really one of the things that changed very drastically, as we'll see here in a second. Also, something that changed drastically is that online shopping had a very high engagement among younger shoppers, and boomers were not really involved. It also spiked very high among high-income households about educating people with higher education, people with children at home. If you think about it, a lot of people that had a lot of pressure on their time, and so convenience was really the main reason why a lot of people shopped online. And of course, much of that has shifted to the notion of safety and wanting to reduce the number of trips in store. Geographically, a lot of the shopping was done among the two coasts, in urban areas, in the bigger cities. And then if you drill down deeper, we saw online engagement be really high in the high income zip codes. all that has changed. We're now seeing great demand for online shopping in some of the most rural areas in the Midwest. Independents all throughout the Midwest report into me that they're seeing between 700 and 1,000% increase in online orders. So geographically, everything is completely changed. So what does all that mean? Well, it means that we're having more than 28% of shoppers who have shopped in the last couple of weeks who are completely new to it. That also means that they might have ordered frozen foods for the first time in their lives. And the important part about anything repeat, whether it's a meal, a brand, or a shopping experience, is making sure that it was a good experience. So those are the kinds of things to keep in mind. All of a sudden, we saw that 46% of shoppers have ordered groceries online during that month of March. If we tighten it even further and we bring it down to just 2 weeks, it was 24% versus the 9% we talked about earlier. So that has put enormous strain on the whole online world. People are trying to hire as many people as they can, and still there are no slots available among many grocers across the country, with 3 days, 4 days, sometimes a week's wait in order to get a slot. So there's a lot of pressure, wait listing happening. So some of that might dampen online engagement a little bit, but for the most part, I think all of a sudden we're in 2025 now in terms of online engagement. And that whole idea of omni-channel strategies becomes ultimately more important. A lot of us believe that it's absolutely there to stay. If we look at some of the engagement in the European countries, they're all of a sudden starting to engage much more with online as well. Think about the fact that a third of those ordering groceries plan to do it more often. So the experiences so far have been very positive for many people. And I have access to shoppers that provide comments after a shopping trip, whether online, in store. And I find it fascinating that so many of people that have ordered online specifically comment on their frozen food purchases. There's almost a level of surprise to say that stuff arrived cold, that it was packaged separately. So that whole notion of working with retailers and working together as a cold supply chain of how can we create a best experience in this whole online world is very important going forward. So what if this indeed continued as we all expect? Well, think about the fact that suddenly older demographics are online. They probably, in every category of the store, buy very different in terms of brands and in terms of portions. Many of them are single and dual households at this point in time. They might want to buy online for continued safety instead of that convenience aspect. We talked about the difference in geography, the differences in income, and more than likely what we're going to continue to see is that combination of online and offline shopping. So in my regard, if I think about this as a brand, winning from the first click in this world is extremely important. Many shoppers start with their heart list or their favorite food list. And how do you make sure that you're on there? How do you make sure that you were in that basket from the very start? And what is your strategy if you were not? So those are very important questions. If you have access to data like Instant Cart, it's also fascinating to look at if people search for a certain item, let's just say you're a frozen veggie brand and it wasn't available due to an out of stock, how do they work around swaps? What is acceptable to them? There are some very interesting behavioral studies that we can be doing right now. So let's talk a little bit about what happens in the frozen space in terms of the sales performance with our partners from IRI. So we're looking here at multi-store outlets, their MULO definition. And in each and every one of these cases, we looked at the increase in sales compared to the similar week last year. So the end dates might not be completely the same, but it's the comparable week last year. Well, the line that represents frozen is still that aqua bluish line. And as you can see, very early on, frozen started to outpace many of the other areas in the store. It outpaced fresh perimeter by a long stretch. Meat did really well. Fresh produce is not. They really have not performed extremely well throughout this entire pandemic. And some of that we'll see later on is actually expressing itself in greater frozen purchases. So very strong performance for frozen. where, as I mentioned before, during those key panic buying weeks, we saw a near doubling of frozen at 94% over the same week last year. So a sales powerhouse, to say the least. When we look into all the different areas of frozen from a higher level point of view, the most recent week is now on the right side of your screen with that yellow box around it. We just continue to see very high above last year kind of numbers. And remember, the week of 4/19 is the week that we went up against the Easter bump of 2019. So typically, when Easter moves back and forth, and we had an earlier Easter this year, we have to go up against the Easter last year. That's a hard bump to beat. And still, frozen foods managed to be nearly 30 points ahead of last year. So that's just fantastic news. And we see continued very high engagement for really every single one of these areas. So let's look at that in a little bit greater detail. First, I tried to look at the types of categories that are more of a total solution for either a total meal or a part of a meal. So we're looking here at frozen meals, we're looking at desserts, baked goods, frozen snacks, as well as frozen beverages. And as I mentioned earlier, we're just really seeing fantastic sales numbers throughout the entire 7-8 week pandemic period now, including one of the powerhouses has been frozen pizza, for instance. I think in past years, a lot of shoppers told us that's my backup meal. If I run out of time and I run out of energy to cook, others said, well, we do plan it in as an actual meal. But clearly, as we're seeing here now, our frozen pizza that week of March 22nd was 143% over the comparable week last year. This is one of those items that people put in their freezer to make sure that they had something in their house. But the fact that the number stayed elevated, and really the same true for virtually every line on this chart, the fact that the number stayed elevated and we still are looking at 50, 60% over the comparable week last year means that not only did they put that frozen pizza in the freezer, they also are eating it and replenishing it. So that is great news for us. Then looking at some of the more in-meal ingredients, if you will. So here we're looking at frozen meat, poultry, seafood. We're looking at frozen fruits and vegetables. Again, fantastic growth. As I mentioned, fresh meat did really, really well. They saw a near doubling of the total fresh meat category, but looking here at these numbers, certainly people were engaging with frozen meat as well. Every single one of these numbers is extremely strong throughout the period. Same for frozen vegetables. If you look at produce, frozen vegetables, and fruit for that matter, have been far outpacing the growth in fresh. Now, in part that is because they're smaller in terms of their base sale, but there's definitely a lot of switching happening from fresh to frozen. And I think one of our challenges as an industry is making sure that that switch is as positive as an experience as possible. We all know if people have good experiences, they're more likely to stick with it. So now let's talk a little bit about understanding the why behind all of this, and that's where our survey comes in. So first of all, we asked people, of course, as a screener, have you bought frozen items since early March? That's pretty much what the question boiled down to. And 86% of people had. Now, you might say, hey, wait a minute, I know household penetration for frozen is right around 99%. Keep in mind that 99% is based on an entire year, and it's also based on just one single purchase. So if somebody went to the store to pick up some ice cream for a party, they are now counted in that household penetration. So the 86% is more the self-reported. Did you buy frozen, and did you buy it before was another question we asked. And 7% said, no, I did not consider myself a frozen food buyer pre-pandemic. So those would be those people that might have picked up a gallon or a pint of ice cream, but don't really consider themselves a frozen food purchaser. So that's fascinating because that means we had new feet coming down the aisle. So that is win number one. And they were also key wins in that we saw all of a sudden engagement among population groups where we know we're running behind. And those were people like the boomers. Many boomers engage with frozen a whole lot less than some of the other age groups. We saw great engagement with singles. Those are people that typically eat out instead of cooking meals at home, and clearly frozen was one of these great solutions that they took to during the height of the pandemic. Then we continued on with those people who said they had bought food. So that was that 86% of people that had bought frozen food, I should say. And we asked them 3 questions to start. Did you buy more? Did you buy different items than you bought pre-pandemic? And did you perhaps buy different brands than you normally buy as well, whether they were unavailable or just something that you hadn't bought before? And as you can see, for every single one of them, it's about 7 in 10 of these shoppers that said, yes, I bought more. Yes, I bought different. Yes, I bought different brands. So we're looking at a world where all of a sudden we're having not only new feed down the aisle, but we're also having people that are engaging with brands and items that they haven't bought before, or at least not bought in many years. So that is a huge opportunity for frozen foods and individual brands to make a whole new impression on many new people. So let's look at that. And I just wanted to show you some of these charts. I know they're hard to see here on your monitor, but I wanted to show you what is available in the report. It's all broken out, and there's way more breaks in the report than I could cram here on our screen. But some of the engagement, every single question is broken out by things like the generations, by the lower incomes through all the way to higher incomes, by do people have kids living at home, the household size. But we also asked that question again, just like we did in the Power of Frozen, is what does your freezer situation look like? Do you have one of those shoebox size freezers within the fridge, or do you have a standalone freezer? One of the really interesting things that happened during the pandemic is that, yes, again, we saw a huge surge in the number of people that bought standalone freezers. There's been many articles about that. And of course, we also had them self-rate whether they were frequent shoppers, yay or nay. And we looked at behaviors like that to be able to understand where some of the growth was happening. We also did the same thing for who bought more items or different items. And that's where we see experimentation happening in some of those unusual groups like Gen Z and boomers. Lower income started to engage with frozen food a whole bunch more. So again, I can't stress enough the importance about not just having new people down the aisle, but also having people all of a sudden starting to buy items they have never bought before. And that is a gigantic opportunity for brands to start connecting with more people while continuing to connect with people of their base who may not have been able to purchase their preferred brands throughout the recession, throughout the pandemic. Here we're looking at the first time trial and stocking up during the pandemic, and what you're seeing here is the different items. And we asked people basically to go through the list, anything from vegetables to pizza to meat and poultry, and for every single one, list whether or not it was the first time they bought it, they did not buy it, or they bought the same amount as usual, or the fourth option was I stocked up more than usual. So here again, first of all, we saw that 7% of shoppers that don't consider themselves freezer shoppers now engaged with the aisle. But if we go down this list, we see that we have a lot of first-time buyers for areas like meat and poultry, for entrees, for frozen food. And it was interesting to actually align this list against some of the household penetration in these items and realize that people open doors in other parts of the freezer that they normally skipped by. So that's opportunity number 2, is more shoppers and shoppers engaging with whole new categories. That middle column shows who bought as much as they did before, but the column on your right is extremely important as well, because that showed I stocked up more than before. And you have to go pretty far down the list to see the numbers dropping below 30% of shoppers saying I bought more than usual. So that really was causing all those empty freezers that we saw throughout the pandemic shopping, and we continue to see. Stocking up increased along with the size of the household. That was an important finding as well. We saw that earlier in the general IRI data that people with children were ramping up their spending disproportionately, and we're seeing the same in the frozen food aisle. I think that's an important finding because people with children tend to engage with different types of items and different package sizes They might buy multiple times a week. So understanding how this all plays out is an important thing going forward over these next couple of weeks. Very important question. And we realize that we asked the satisfaction of purchases really throughout all the different goods. So we didn't have them rate their satisfaction by pizza, by meat, etc. But still, as I've said several times now, having a good experience really leads into a repeat experience. And when we ask people to rate on a 5-point scale, convenience, quality, taste, price, and nutrition, every single one of them got a very nice high rating, especially convenience, which we know that is the main reason why people say they buy frozen. But look at that average score for quality at 4.1, 75% rated at top two box. Taste too has a very high rating with 71% top two box. So people are very satisfied with the frozen food they buy, and I think that bodes well. We actually asked shoppers that question, and we said, you bought frozen foods during the last 6-7 weeks. Are you thinking, what are you thinking your frozen food purchases are going to look like in the next couple of months? Now, we realize it's hard for people to look ahead. We don't know what is ahead, but these numbers are extremely strong. Looking at 18% of shoppers saying, I'm going to buy a lot more, 32% somewhat more, or at the very least, there's a lot of them who believe they will buy as much. So this is looking extremely good for the frozen food category for the next couple of months. So the real question is, what was driving that? That's a really important one. And some were, I think, obvious, and some are really big clues as to how frozen food has come to the rescue in many cases. The biggest one at 60% was shelf life. We saw from our surveys that people want 2 to 3 weeks worth of food in their pantries, fridges, and freezers just in case there were going to be shortages. That was actually the number 2 at 58%. But it also is part of the continued behavior in the future, because some people say, well, I'm buying frozen because I want to minimize my trips to the grocery store. Ease of preparation, of course, popped to the top. That's always one associated with frozen food, the time savings. But another really big one, I think, is people have great trust in the food safety of frozen food. And a little bit further down, you actually see people expressing some fear in buying fresh produce and fresh meat. So those are some of the reasons in which some of the fresh food dollars, especially in produce, have started to switch to frozen, and we're actually seeing that in the sales numbers as well. IRI looked at some of the big brands, and they found out, for instance, that one of the big national frozen entree brands has 4 million new shoppers gained in just the last couple of weeks. So we have a huge opportunity, even if we retain just a fraction of those shoppers. All that can lead to hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue per year, and trying to figure out how to really get to that key on loyalty and continued loyalty while maintaining our original base, I think is extremely important going forward. So a lot of people ask me about going forward. How far is that new baseline going to lie above the old normal? Well, that's the question on all of our minds, and I wish I had the answer. But to me, I think that the future is going to look highly regionalized. If we just think about some of the most populous states around the U.S., New York was extremely hard hit, still is extremely hard hit. That situation isn't going to change anytime soon. Then we look at California, another huge state in terms of the population. They have not started to open back up or really have given any indication when that might happen. Then you look at Texas, which has many of the biggest cities in the country. They have started to open partially back up. So I think a lot of the engagement is going to relate to where are you at, how much was the economic impact, and how much was the impact of the virus itself. So with many others, we put together what we call, inputs into the crystal ball. Rather than giving you a number, what are some of the areas to look at? So it's anything from how long is that virus going to be around? How long is their social distancing measures going to be around? Which of those short-term habits are here to stay? What kind of new economic reality are we going to look at on the other end of this thing? What are some of the new competitive and also the departmental realities? And then, of course, a lot of us took some battle time, some wartime decisions on things like line extensions, packet sizes. Which one of those are here to stay? So let's quickly look at some of those. Right now, as I mentioned, we're looking at a complete patchwork of what states are doing in terms of their mandates, loosening them up, and every set of circumstances because of it is quite unique. So I think we have to look at when do things start to open back up in terms of restaurant competition, but also in terms of when are schools resuming, when are evening activities happening again, when do people start to travel again? Of course, we're going to the summer season. Are people going to actually engage with holidays like Memorial Day and Mother's Day the way they have in past years? But beyond the actual measures and the actual virus being around, what is people's mindset in that, all of that too? We saw earlier some statistics from people who are just saying, yeah, you know what, even if restaurants open back up, I don't see myself going back there for a number of weeks. So it's not just the physical measures and the actual virus still being here, it's also what is people's mindset. And think about some of the generational imprints and all of that too, or millennials now for the second time are going through a really big economic impact on their careers and their lives. New habits are formed very easily, and certainly coronavirus saw a lot of new habits. We talked about a lot of them early on with people buying things like freezers and air fryers and pizza ovens. They're learning how to bake. Baking aisle is still 108% over normal. All of America is baking bread, baking cookies. Stress baking is a thing. The brand loyalties, we've talked about that. Everything from how important does freezer-ready packaging become in the meat department, for instance, or shelf life of frozen foods at home, the hoarding hangover. And I think there is something that we should look at as an industry. How can we help people cook out of their freezers and create these great experiences? I mentioned the whole idea of the economic reality that we're emerging into on the other end of this, or really already are in. Something important to keep in mind is the temporary increase of SNAP benefits. Everybody at this point is maximized in terms of dollars for the next couple of months. Many states have applied to be on SNAP Online, which was very limited pre-pandemic. So if more of those SNAP dollars are moving online, it's also likely that more of those dollars are starting to move online. So keep that in mind for your brands as well. And then, of course, what's going to happen in terms of recession? I mean, look back to 2008 to 2012 when we saw those big recessionary behaviors. How do people engage with your brands, with your stores? And also consider that effect of the economic scarring, as I call it, where even if people are no longer affected, maybe get their job back after being furloughed, there is still that lingering, well, what if it's back next winter? I should be starting to save up some money. So there is still going to be more than likely a focus on need-based categories. And there might be some pressure on discretionary spending as well as putting off bigger spending. So number 4, we've seen some forms of retail really drop off. For instance, people are engaging with convenience stores a whole lot less. Many people go to convenience stores, obviously, as a start to gas up their cars, maybe get their morning cup of coffee. All that isn't happening right now. So convenience stores have seen a big drop off in traffic, but many other just bifurcation in terms of retail as well. Some brands have done real well. What are some of the items that retailers are going to right size or limited SKUs in going forward? It's very likely we're going to see just less retail space. That was a trend that was already happening. Some of the non-food retailers might just not come back for it. And how is that going to change traffic patterns in certain shopping plazas? How is people's focus on packaging going to change? Plastic was kind of in the bullseye. Right now, consumers are all about plastic packaging because they realize it's there for safety. So safety is one of these things. And last but not least, a lot of us focus on operational efficiencies, whatever side of the aisle, whatever link of the supply chain you're in. We saw packaging companies say, you know, do we really need all these different sizes, all these different ways? We can run a line a lot more efficiently if we limit the number of SKUs. We saw that in label companies. We saw it in the manufacturing side. We saw a lesser focus on introducing new items. And that really, that pressure came from all ends of the supply chain. So which one of those are here to stay? That's something else to look at, as it will definitely impact the future going forward. So as always, we're doing these weekly reports, as Adrian mentioned, and we're always looking for stories, for pictures, to really bring those numbers to life. So if you have anything to share with us, you see Adrian's and my email right there. And Adrian, I'm going to bounce it back over to you to see if there's any questions for us.
Great. Thank you, Anne Marie, for those insights. And we do have some questions. As you were going through, Anne Marie, some of the sales figures, the question came through: what happened to desserts and baked goods the week of April 19th? It looked like there was a bit of a decline there.
Yeah, I think that is one of those areas that is holiday related. And so the week before that, April 12th, we saw actually a big spike in baked goods. And the answer actually is twofold. So first of all, it's Easter. So that week of the 19th, we were going up against Easter 2019. And so people that were looking for those types of baked goods, maybe for a big Easter breakfast or rolls with dinner, that's the bump that we were going up against. So that's part of the reason why it dropped down. The other reason is that all of America is baking. There is not yeast, flour, nothing to be found. And so for some people, that is scratch off baking. For some people, they're actually putting their entire breads together themselves. So some of the stores have actually been running low in any bread supply, whether it's in the baking aisle, in their own baked goods aisle, or in the frozen food aisle. So availability might be part of those numbers as well.
Great. The other question we had, do you think consumers will shy away from finger foods as concerns over hygiene grows?
I absolutely do. So some of the other categories I look at is candy, deli prepared, the whole deli department. And what retailers are reporting into me is that they've actually gotten to the point where many of them have closed bulk sales. And so that is in the store environment. But many of us believe that there's just that social anxiety about touching anything that somebody else might have touched. And so that is the reason why many retailers have actually closed the deli prepared operation. So salad bars and hot bars, all those things are closed in many retailers, not everybody, but many. And bulk foods, whether candy or oats, those type of things, are all closed. And they are even seeing that people are not too hot on touching things like kiosks that they'll need to use in order to get the price on those items. So if you translate that to the at-home environment, or things like the candy bowl at work, or any kind of sharing that is done in food, I absolutely think some of that will translate into some anxiety among especially the older shoppers that have been affected by coronavirus disproportionately, with the whole notion of sharing food. And that's part of, I think, that latent social anxiety that I mentioned in one of the earlier bullets of the crystal ball input.
And along those lines, do you anticipate a bounce back for hot deli prepared foods?
So right now, and if anybody is interested in those numbers, right now, deli prepared is down 40%. And it doesn't matter whether you look at rotisserie chicken or pizza or the salad bar or entrees, it is pretty much down 40% or more. In part, that is because the operations are closed. Some retailers have transferred the items into prepackaged goods, so you just can still buy the same soup, but you have to heat it up at home. That is working reasonably well. But a lot of the deli foods guys are struggling with, what am I going to do? Are consumers actually going to go back to eating from a salad bar, or should I just start moving my operations into more of that? It is still freshly cooked. It is still a meal solution, but it's something that you need to heat up at home. So there is a lot of just up in the air on that, and just looking to see how this whole thing is developing. But for now, deli prepared solutions are not doing well, and not really coming back online either.
Another question that came in, are you seeing a reduction, Anne-Marie, in manufacturers' sales promotion because of demand created by COVID-19?
Yeah, so a lot is happening in that regard. So first of all, things are flying off the shelf. So I do see really manufacturers across fresh and frozen and everybody else pull back a little bit on ad money. And some of them are actually reallocating those ad dollars to community efforts and donating to food banks, et cetera. But it's not just a pullback on ad money. It's also the fact that a lot of retailers just simply didn't have circulars, especially during those key weeks. And that was for several reasons. First of all, again, the food was flying off the shelf to begin with. It was all hands on deck in the retail environment, so they didn't have time. But more than anything, those circulars are laid out weeks in advance. And so at that point in time, nobody in the warehouse, nobody on the buying desk had any idea what would be in stock in terms of what could go into those circulars. So a lot of retailers have come back online in terms of circulars and ads. But a lot of them have cut back to just a back and front or 4-page circular, nothing like the 16-page ordeals that we saw before. So a lot of that has to do with pullback on ad dollars, but also a pullback on what is going to be available. A lot of retailers tell me too that one of the side effects has been that a lot of the little bitty newspapers in small towns have gone out of business because a lot of their ad dollars come from local retail, local food service, I should say. And just in small marketplaces, they're missing out on hundreds of thousands in distribution already, with more little newspapers going out of business. So the other issue is clean aisle policies, not so much in frozen, but the aisles have to be clear to make sure people can be 6 feet apart. So secondary displays are difficult. Some retailers have moved to, instead of having the clip coupons, automatically putting them in people's wallets. So everybody is trying to figure out how are we going to do CPRs and features and displays in this new reality.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you mentioned, our Power of Frozen report, and we looked at freezers there. And what we saw was that the core frozen food shopper was stocking up on frozen when there was a sales promotion, right, for that second freezer. But I think the coronavirus pandemic has really changed that, the shopping behavior quite a bit.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
other
I would agree. I think it's part. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, I think it's in part people have expressed a desire to have 2 to 3 weeks worth of food in their pantry, freezer, fridge. So in part, that's what's driving it. But then it's also simply higher everyday demand. Instead of maybe the kid eating at school or lunch at school, breakfast, lunch at school, now they're serving breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, etc. at home. So it's a very different world.
Anne-Marie, have you seen or have you looked at the comparison of sales of frozen vegetables versus canned? Have you, along those lines too, have you looked at low perishable versus convenience purchases?
Yeah, so the same report that Adrian mentioned early on in frozen, I read it for produce as well. And it's been fascinating. So during 2019, which was a very typical year, about 85% of total produce dollars go to fresh. And then canned is a little bit bigger, I believe, top of my head, I can look the numbers up, but 85% goes to fresh. Then during the height of the pandemic buying, it was only 70% of produce dollars, total store produce dollars, that were going to fresh. And so people started to really stock up on both shelf stable, so canned, and frozen. And frozen veg has been outperforming all the other areas ever since the start of the pandemic. And I think some of the reasons that we saw emerging from the AFFI study on safety, being scared to eat fresh produce, on having items on hand, people really struggling to figure out, what items in fresh can I buy to eat now and save for later. So I think frozen produce has seen an enormous win ever since the second week of March.
Great. On the topic of produce, with data showing reduction in fresh consumption, do you think this will include fresh seasonal fruits like blueberries and strawberries?
Yeah, so again, ping me and I'll send you the produce report. I'm happy to share that with everybody. Also, it's available on the PMA website if you have access to that. And so berries, we're tracking okay the week of Easter, but they've actually just fallen flat. And if you looked at the fresh side, vegetables have been outperforming fruit ever since the start of the pandemic, which is a trend that we saw in 2019 and 2018 as well. But it's starting to widen. And this very last week that we have data about from April 19, fruit, and again, they went up against Easter 2019, so that's important to mention, but fruit was actually down a little bit. And the overall fresh produce department was only up 3% versus that 40% number that we saw for frozen. So we just continue to see that very high demand for frozen vegetables and fruit, and we just especially see some of that fear expressing itself in fruit. And we also have to keep in mind, fresh fruit, a big part of that was impulse. Well, now we're dealing with a situation where people don't want to go to the store. When they're in store, they want to race as fast as possible. Then they see a pretty display. They're worried about other people having touched it. So it's affecting fresh fruit disproportionately at the moment.
All right. Well, I want to close with one last question that really looks at the future demand of frozen. So I want you to rub that crystal ball. You know, this was our first consumer survey that we did together, and we can certainly repeat this survey over time. And we also know that, you know, what consumers say they're going to do and what they actually do don't always align. So do you think that this future demand at retail for frozen will, you know, go into the future?
I truly do. And, you know, I don't often make predictions, and it's very hard to slap a number on there because I think it really depends whether you're a frozen vegetable or meat or what have you. Like I said, it's going to be very regional as well. But a couple of inputs into that. First of all, we had new feed down the aisle. We had people buying items they never bought before. The overall experience, as we saw, was very positive, and that's one of the biggest indicators as to people repeating the experience. We saw people buying freezers. Well, those people are certainly going to continue to buy more frozen food. But above all, we're just going to continue to see a lot more at-home occasions for the foreseeable future. And, you know, a lot of people are still not the greatest cooks or don't want to cook. It's skill and will, as I always say. And so I think frozen is going to track ahead of the old normal by quite a bit, especially if we, for instance, look at some of the countries that are ahead of us in terms of dealing with coronavirus and where they're at. They're starting to level off at about 10% above the same week last year for many categories, but frozen continues to sit well above that. So even in countries like Holland, where I'm originally from, frozen was never very big. People go to the store every couple of days, and frozen was just something that very few people engaged in. Frozen foods there just continue to track at double digits. Germany and France and Spain, countries that have traditionally been very focused on fresh. So just looking at the trends in some of those countries, I just have to imagine that the future for frozen is extremely bright.
That's great, and that's what we like to hear. All right, well, with that, Anne-Marie, thank you so much for your insights today. Again, a webinar recording will be distributed, and continue to ask us any other questions that might arise after today's webinar. But thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.